Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Tom Woodley, and I'm the president of Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, CJPME. We are just so happy to welcome everyone here to today's webinar, Community Q&A, What's Happening in Palestine, with guests Michael Bueckert, Mark Ayyash, and Rasha Budeiri. As we begin, I'd like to recognize that we have people joining from across Canada and panelists in both Montreal and Ottawa regions. And as such, this event is taking place on Indigenous land across Turtle Island. As someone in Montreal, I live on the unceded territory of the Mohawk Nation, which has historically been known as a gathering place for many nations. And in Ottawa, on the land on which we live is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. The Algonquin peoples lived on that land since time immemorial, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to be present in that territory as well. Knowledge is power, and we are so appreciative of everyone who has taken the time out of their busy schedules to participate in this session here tonight. Some people will tell you that the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians is complicated, that it's been going on for centuries, that it's a religious conflict, that it can't be solved. But those are all false assertions. It's a recent conflict, and it's all about land. Hopefully, following this session, you'll have a better grasp of the fundamentals and will feel more comfortable talking to your friends. Hopefully, this can be a starting point, and you can take more time in the coming days and weeks to become even more familiar with the context in Palestine-Israel. If you're like us in CJPME, you are absolutely livid about Israel's provocation and brutality against Palestinians in Gaza. In Gaza, Jerusalem, and elsewhere in historic Palestine. But also like us, you're probably heartbroken over the loss of life and destruction in Gaza. We've had a lot of inquiries the past few weeks about how to send aid to Gaza, and I'm happy to say that the CJPME Foundation just today was able to launch a campaign for emergency aid to Gaza. Working with Canadian and Gaza partners, the aid will provide food kits, medical kits, clothing, and other needs. We're looking to raise $50,000 to send in the next week if possible. So the web link is gazaaid.ca, Gazaaid, one word, Gazaaid.ca. Let me go ahead and put up a screen so everyone can see that and share. And let me page down. There we are. So gazaaid.ca, if you have it on your heart to give to the humanitarian needs, the emergency humanitarian needs of the people in Gaza, we would love to benefit from your generosity. We work with a Canadian partner who then works in turn with a Gaza partner on the ground in Gaza. That relationship has been in place for years. They've done a lot of great projects, and we worked with them as well last year. So they do great work. If you're able to give, that would be just fantastic. And one other thing to mention on that, donations are tax deductible in Canada. The project is being managed by the CJPME Foundation, which is a Canadian charity, which is able to issue charitable tax receipts. So thanks to anyone who's able to contribute. Our event this evening will be split into two parts. We'll start by paging through a few slides which touch on some of the history of Palestine. And truly, we will be literally just mentioning many of the key historical reference points. But they'll serve potentially as jumping off points for later reading and digging, if you'd like, and potentially later on in our Q&A session. Then after that brief overview, we will introduce our guests and begin the Q&A. To participate in the Q&A, if you haven't been in a webinar, a Zoom webinar before, you'll have the opportunity to submit your questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of the control panel on your screen. So just click on that button and you can start typing in your questions. And all of the panelists, myself, Mark, Michael, and Rasha, will be able to see those questions and go through them and answer the ones that we can. The panelists will address as many questions as they can during the Q&A session, during the Q&A session, sorry. And we'll wrap up our event together probably around in about an hour, maybe a little bit more than an hour, so to see how we're going with the questions. Just a quick word about CJPME. Our mission is to empower Canadians of all backgrounds to promote justice, development, and peace in the Middle East and here at home in Canada. If you're not familiar with our work, we do a whole variety of different things: advocacy campaigns, policy analysis, speaking tours, training, lobbying to politicians, and many other things. Actually, really pleased to say that just this morning, after months of preparation and planning, we actually co-hosted a call between Canadian, American, and European parliamentarians, which resulted in a very powerful joint statement calling for concrete pressure on Israel to respect Palestinian human rights. You can see that on our Facebook page or our Instagram, or of course our Twitter as well. So really exciting to see that collaboration across the Atlantic and see very progressive leaders in legislators taking action on that. So without further ado, let's take a few moments to page through some of the history of historic Palestine. And once I do that, right after that, we'll introduce our panelists. But just to give you a few reference points here. So there we are. So the best place to start with in talking about Israel-Palestine is, of course, the Ottoman Empire. I'm not going to spend time on this, but the Ottoman Empire was in place for 500, 600 years, and they controlled much of the Middle East for hundreds of years prior to World War I, which is our next juncture. So the Ottoman Empire, of course, was aligned with the Germans in World War I, with the Axis powers in Germany, and the British actually managed to convince the people in the Arab countries to actually join them in revolting against the Ottoman Empire, which they did successfully in the course of World War I. A few key dates, and all these things are just jumping off points. I'm just flying through these slides. This presentation is available to everyone, and maybe my colleague Michael can put a link in the chat or make the link available afterwards. You also have the World Zionist Congress. The first World Zionist Congress was meeting took place in 1898, talking about a Jewish homeland for the Jewish diaspora in Europe. The Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1960, where England and France agreed to how they were going to divide up the Middle East after World War I. Then you have the McMahon-Hussein Correspondence, where the British promised the Middle East to the Arabs. And then you have the Balfour Declaration in 1917, where the British also promised a national home for the Jews in Palestine, Treaty of Versailles, and several other things. This is the Sykes-Picot Agreement, a map of it. You see Britain took control of Palestine, the Transjordan area in Iraq, whereas the French took control of Syria and Lebanon after World War I. Just flying through this, a bit of discussion here about the British Mandate period. So the British were in control of the Levant of Palestine, historic Palestine, between World War I and World War II. There was a lot going on at that time. You see these bullet points here. The Jews knew something was going to happen. The Arabs, the Palestinians knew something was going to happen in a few decades. The anti-Semitism was rampant in Europe. There was a lot of Jewish emigration to Palestine, Israel. At that time, it was Palestine. Here's some photographs. Again, this presentation is available to folks after. Some photographs of both the Jews and the Arabs in Mandate Palestine at that time. Britain, after World War II, wanted to wash their hands of the area, so they passed the issue off to the United Nations, which was very young at that time. And the United Nations came up with a partition plan. You see it here in the map on the right. Jerusalem was to be a shared international city. The brown sections on this map were to have become what they called the Arab state. The blue sections of this map were to have become what they called the Jewish state. One thing that I will point out about the partition plan is the partition plan mentioned that if you were an Arab living in what was to become the Jewish state, you had the right to stay in your home, and vice versa. If you were a Jew living in what was to become the Arab state, you had the right to stay in your home. Obviously, it did not happen like that. You had the War of 1948. We won't get into that, but there was the surrounding countries invaded. At the same time, there was militias in Palestine, Israel at that time, again, it was Palestine that were fighting. Just rushing through this. As a result, following the War of 1948, Jordan took control of the West Bank. They invaded and took control of the West Bank. Egypt invaded and was left with a portion which is now called the Gaza Strip. So those are the two major things. The rest of what was to become the Arab state was actually taken over by Israel, as well as West Jerusalem. So that map tells a little bit that story in those bullet points. Here's a slide about what happened with Palestinian refugees. Huge number of Palestinian refugees created at that time. The most conservative estimates would say about 700,000 Palestinians became refugees. And they fled, of course, to Gaza, to the West Bank, to Jordan, to Syria, to Lebanon, some even to Egypt, and some to Iraq. That's why today, more than half of the population of Gaza, they are refugees or descendants of refugees. So that's the refugee situation. Then you had the 1967 war. The Israelis call it the 6 Days War. Arab armies massed their troops on the borders with Israel. Actually, Israel launched a preemptive attack. At that point, they invaded and occupied the Sinai Peninsula here in the south. They invaded and occupied the West Bank, Gaza, and the Syrian Golan Heights. So there you see on this left map, the 1967, right after the 1967 war, and sort of here's the map today on the right. One other thing I'll mention is that since 1967, actually starting in 1967, Israel started moving parts of its civilian population into both the West Bank and Gaza. That is strictly against international law. Occupying powers do not have the right to transfer parts of their civilian population into territory that they occupy. And so when we talk about Israeli settlements, this is what we're talking about. It's sort of a colonization process where Israel is moving its civilian population into the West Bank territory, which is slated in some plans to become part of a future Palestinian state. Bottom line here is this is sort of what you see generally as a map. Well, actually, here's a better summary of the maps. We have historic Palestine, sort of prior to 1946, land that was owned by the Palestinians, which is in green here on the leftmost map. Land that was owned by Jewish citizens is in white. So obviously, I think it was about 97% to 6%. The partition plan gave 53% of the land to the Jews and 47% of the land to the Arabs, even though at that time the Arabs were about 66% of the population. Following the war around 1948, you were left with the West Bank and Gaza. At the West Bank, of course, being occupied by Jordan, the Gaza being occupied by Egypt. And then, of course, present, I was talking in the earlier slide about the settlements. Here we see the settlements are sort of placed in red, very high level map. But you see sometimes people talk about the West Bank archipelago in terms of that Israel, its settlements and access roads and so on, have cut up the land into very small pieces. And so I think a lot of us in the news are talking a lot about Sheikh Jarrah, and we're very fortunate to have one of our panelists whose family is actually living in Sheikh Jarrah as we speak today. So that will be one of the things that we'll hope to touch on a bit today. We've also, of course, the last week or two, there's been a lot of talk about the Al-Aqsa Mosque and Israel's aggression towards the Ramadan worshippers there in the mosque. We've also seen the Palestinian uprising and some mobs in the streets of Israel where mobs of Jewish young people are going around looking for Palestinians, and even some Palestinian rioters going around a little bit as well. And then, of course, the situation in Gaza, the Hamas launching the rockets, and then Israel retaliating just entirely disproportionately, and the destruction and death there. And of course, just in general, the overall context of the apartheid, sort of state of apartheid, which is right now resident in Israel. As many people may have heard, Human Rights Watch came out with a report just weeks ago, which confirmed what other groups had been saying, that according to the legal analysis of Human Rights Watch, that in fact Israel has been practicing or has been committing the crime against humanity of apartheid and persecution. So there we see on the bottom a wall. I hadn't mentioned that. So I think with that, I will start to now introduce our panelists, so you don't have to listen to me so much anymore, and we'll get to mention some very, very interesting people and knowledgeable people, and some Palestinian Canadians too. So without further ado, first we have CJPME's very own Dr. Michael Bueckert. Michael has his PhD in sociology with a specialization in political economy from Carleton University. His dissertation compared opposition to the BDS movement to opposition to the boycott of South Africa. He's published in many different journals and news outlets and was active in the student movement for many years. He's joined CJPME as vice president since June 2020. So thank you and welcome, Michael. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Mark Ayyash, professor of sociology and anthropology at Mount Royal University in Calgary. His research interests include the study of violence, social and political theory, post-colonial theory, social movements, as well as the history, culture, and politics of the Middle East, particularly Palestine, Israel. And finally, last but not least, we have Rasha Budeiri. Rasha was born and raised in Jerusalem, Palestine, and holds a bachelor's degree in mass communications and sociology from Birzeit University in the West Bank. She worked with Palestinian communities through her employment at the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees in Jerusalem. After several years of working in the media and NGO fields in Jerusalem, she spent some time in the Gulf and now resides in Ottawa, Canada. Rasha's family lives in Sheikh Jarrah and currently faces eviction threats. So please join me in welcoming Michael, Mark, and Rasha. And if we were in an auditorium, we'd all be clapping. So thank you very much. So guys, how do we want to start off here? You'll have to all come off mute there first. Rasha, I think you wanted to talk about, you want to give us a bit about the ceasefire and how you interpret the ceasefire, Rasha?
Of course, especially, first of all, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Michael, for the opportunity for putting this together. Such crucial times, critical times that we're all going through. And I know there's a lot of questions, and I see a lot of them already in the Q&A. So I will just briefly mention the latest, I would like to comment about the latest news that we're seeing on the ceasefire. Just a very important point is the fact that, yes, a ceasefire is something that we're all happy to see, but at the same time, we do need to keep in mind that what we're looking for is Israel's and the occupation cease of its siege on Gaza, which has been going on for at least 15 years. What we want to see is an end to the injustice, the occupation, the land theft, the home demolitions, the brutal attacks, the systematic colonial settler actions that we're seeing every single day, the fact that we're seeing annexation of Palestinian land across the West Bank, even also orders that we're seeing in the 1948 territories of house demolitions and just shifting and changing the demographics in the 1948 territories. So I do hope that, yes, we do celebrate the ceasefire. We do want an end to the daily killing of innocent Palestinians, of such attacks on the medical facilities, on journalists, on women, children, commercial buildings. But at the same time, we need to keep in mind that we had a ceasefire in 2014, and now we're at it again. So we can't be, yes, we will be optimistic, but at the same time, we need to be very cautious and keep in mind that history keeps repeating itself when it comes to the occupation. Unless we treat the root cause, we will see this as a recurring event.
Yeah, and if I may jump in here, just to echo all of the points that Rasha just made. And sort of bring to simple terms what that root cause of the problem is. And thank you, Tom, for those excellent slides. And I know some people were saying, "Oh my God, that's so fast!" And I hope you do share the slides with them. And everybody should, of course, learn all of these things and more. And as a scholar, of course, I certainly support that. But you can spend a lifetime learning about all of the plans of the different empires, the Ottomans and the British and the Arab states and the Americans, and all of those intricacies which are critical. But let me just summarize it for you in simple terms. This problem is the problem of the expulsion of the Palestinian peoples from their land. That's it. No group of people on earth takes kindly to their expulsion and domination from their land. That's why Palestinians resist. That's why they have always resisted Israel. That's why they still resist it today, because Israel is continuing that process of expulsion. It hasn't stopped. As you see in that graph, right, where you see the maps and the color of the territories change, right? That hasn't stopped changing, right? So we haven't, unfortunately, seen the last one yet. It could even get worse than what we see today. So that process of expulsion of people from land is ongoing. That's why we call it settler colonialism. That's what settler colonialism is. It eliminates the native population off of their land and replaces them with settlers coming in from elsewhere. And Zionism and the Israeli state has always been about creating what they want, which is exclusive Jewish sovereignty, right? And the key word there is exclusive, meaning that the state has to be exclusively for the Jewish people. And therefore, all non-Jewish people would be considered either second-class citizens or those who should be killed or expelled from their land. So, Sheikh Jarrah, what basically it is it's a microcosm of that entire history. That's why it garnered that much attention from all Palestinians everywhere. It didn't matter that Palestinians in Gaza may not know anyone in Sheikh Jarrah. It didn't matter that Palestinians born and raised in Chile didn't know anyone in Sheikh Jarrah. We all know the same story. We all know the same story of expulsion. That's what brought the Palestinians from all of those different places on earth together, because we have that same story of being expelled from the land. And yes, absolutely, a ceasefire. Of course, we all wanted an immediate stop to the, brutal onslaught, Israeli onslaught on Gaza. And that's, of course, I'm happy for all the people in Gaza tonight, and I hope that they finally get a night's sleep tonight. But don't listen to anyone who says the suffering has ended. The suffering didn't start with these events. The suffering got worse with these events, but it's going to continue after them, because that process of settler colonialism, of apartheid, is still ongoing. And so people need to stay on top of this. It's inevitable that this is now going to, at some point, it's not going to appear on your news anymore. It's not going to show up on your social media as much. All of those things are inevitably in all social movements and all struggles for freedom and liberation. They always go through ups and downs in terms of how much attention they get. But just because you're not seeing that attention and that focus on it doesn't mean that on the ground people are not still suffering and still fighting. Palestinians have never stopped resisting, have never stopped fighting for their liberation. And so please, I ask you all to stay engaged. Make sure you write to your politicians, as some people here are suggesting in the Q&A. Write to your politicians, call them, tell your friends to call them and write to them, sign petitions. When the media does a good story, call them and tell them you did great, cover more, do more of that. When they don't, call them and tell them, hey, bring on Palestinian voices. What are you afraid of? Why aren't you putting them on TV to explain what's happening? So we do need people power. Palestinians are all about people power, and they need people power elsewhere to support them. So please don't lose your engagement. Continue to educate yourselves. Continue to put pressure on your politicians. Continue to put pressure on your media, and we'll get there.
Fantastic. Yeah, Michael, do you want to add anything?
That was great. Maybe what I'll add is just that maybe just to underline the point that all of these underlying dynamics are still in place. When the rockets started 10, 11 days ago, there was already an uprising that had begun. A lot of mobilization around the Sheikh Jarrah evictions, which there was a very important court date, I think around the 10th or so, that was going to be an appeal for the families who were being evicted. It was widely expected that Israel was going to not grant the appeal and that they were going to be thrown out of their homes. That was going to be a flashpoint. When the rocket started, when there was all of this commotion, that court date got postponed, I think 30 days at least. And so that's going to come back. Same thing with restrictions at Al-Aqsa and the violent raids on Al-Aqsa. In the days that also in the last days, it wasn't just sort of an uprising in East Jerusalem and in Gaza, but also across the West Bank. Huge protests inside Israel itself, as Palestinian citizens of Israel were partaking from the sea to the Mediterranean in a general strike a couple of days ago, which is fairly unprecedented in terms of the unification of all these different parts of the Palestinian people. And so all of these things were building, and rockets were only one part of that overall complex of factors. That's the only thing that's gone away. Everything else is still in motion. So there is maybe a concern that we have seen a lot of attention put on these issues in the last days, maybe partly because of the rockets. But I think there's a danger that with the ceasefire, for Israelis, the violence is going to disappear. And perhaps with that, the media coverage, but for Palestinians, all of this daily violence is going to continue. And so I think it is very important to continue the momentum. And I know that there's a lot of demonstrations this weekend, and we'll, I think, try to share some of the information about that in the next days so that people can continue to mobilize on this, because the rockets were only one part of the issue.
Yeah, thank you. Well, all of you brought such fantastic insight on that. Thanks to all of you for your perspective. You know, since we do have the luxury of having Rasha, who actually grew up in Sheikh Jarrah, why don't we we have a lot of different questions on a lot of different topics, but why don't we take the time before the time slips away from us just to talk briefly about Sheikh Jarrah? And for Rasha, why don't you talk a little bit about, you know, your family's perspective and what you're living in, and maybe get into some of the details so people really understand what's going on there. And of course, you grew up there, right? So tell us a little bit about that.
Of course. So yes, you read about Sheikh Jarrah in headlines and on social media, and of course under the hashtag of Save Sheikh Jarrah. I never thought that we would get this far, to be honest, but Sheikh Jarrah for me means my childhood, where I grew up. It's where actually both my grandparents from my mom's and dad's side had houses, but the one that is under the eviction threat, and I hate to call it eviction because it's not a real estate dispute, as they tend to say. It's much deeper than that. And of course, it's part of ethnic cleansing and just displacement and ongoing displacement of Palestinians since 1947 and 1948. So for me, Sheikh Jarrah was the neighborhood where I spent my childhood years, especially where my grandparents lived, and we would visit, of course, after school and spend time there. My parents currently live in that home, but I do want people to realize that this whole Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, the one that we're talking about, 28 families that are about to be evicted, about to be thrown out on the street, are all refugees. They lost property, they lost land, they lost homes in 1948, whether they lived in the western side of Jerusalem. For instance, in my grandparents' case, they lived in Al-Baqa neighborhood on the western side of Jerusalem. But I know other neighbors had homes in Haifa, Jaffa, and others in Jerusalem as well. So it's that time in history where these 28 families lost homes. They were given the opportunity to start all over again and basically re-implant roots, I would say. Try to grow a family and start over. And that's exactly what my grandparents did. They made sure to plant trees that are very Palestinian, oranges and lemons and the citrus trees that we all link to Palestine. And they had an olive tree in their garden. So they wanted to make sure that our roots are still deep in Jerusalem. And that's the house my mom grew up in with 5 other siblings. And then, of course, she married out of that house. My grandparents passed away, my grandma in 1992, my grandpa in 1977, but they made sure that their kids, my aunts, my uncles, continue the legacy. So my mom decided to move into the house, take good care of it. Why? Because we always knew that this whole neighborhood is under the threat. Actually, in 2008 and 2009, we did see three displacements of 3 families, Al-Hannoun, Al-Ghawi, and half the house of Al-Kurd. So, and I'm sure everyone saw the clip of Yaakov, who's a New York-based settler who is now, until this day, living in Al-Kurd family in one half of it. So we always, like, although like memories and the times we spent in that house, especially the times I spent with my cousins, we had a very nice swing. Until this day, it's there, fighting over it to take turns, spending summers there. We always got a sense of the threat that we are seeing unfold today.
So just to be clear, it's because you explain it relatively quickly. Soon after 1948, these various families who had become refugees from other parts of Palestine, then were given a home, I guess, at that point by the Jordanian administration, which administered East Jerusalem at that time. This is sort of like 1949 we're talking about, right?
1956 is when they were given these homes.
Okay.
As part of an agreement with UNRWA, with the United Nations Relief Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East. And based on that agreement, the refugee families' status as refugees and their benefits, so like medical care and access to refugee education and all of that, schooling and all of that, was revoked. So because they were looked at as being given an alternative, basically, to the houses that they lost in 1948. So since 1956, and the neighborhood started expanding. And of course, it was like there were no houses. They were built in 1956.
Okay. And so just to summarize, so for people that haven't been able to follow this very closely, and to come back to Mark's point that this is, it's just sort of ongoing expulsion. So not taking anything away from Mark's point. So that these representatives of Israeli settler groups, they're saying these homes, well, you're saying these homes were built, and they're saying that they actually had these homes from before. So is that?
No, their claim is that the land on which these houses were built were owned by Jews pre-1948. And this wouldn't have happened, this wouldn't be even happening if it wasn't for a law, a discriminatory law actually by the Israeli government that gives anyone who's privileged to be Jewish the ability and the opportunity to claim properties that were owned by Jews pre-1948. On the other hand, there's the absentee law, which basically puts the Israeli control over properties and land and homes owned by Palestinians who had to flee because of all the massacres and the brutal war that we saw in 1948 and the occupation that happened. So that by itself, it just tells you that Jews are given the opportunity to claim properties that are that they claim were theirs before 1948. On the other hand, Palestinians do not have that right. If it was possible, then we would be claiming all of Palestine back.
Exactly. I just want to be clear that I want to make sure people understood that. My father-in-law, who's Palestinian, who's from Jaffa, Palestine, he finally, as a Canadian, he went back in the early 90s to visit his home. And of course, Israel would not permit him to say, well, this is my family's home, but you can stay here if you pay me rent.
Yeah.
So obviously, there's this obviously just total injustice and Israel is trying to say of course it's a real estate dispute. Mark
and sorry, Tom, just to make it clear so that people who, as you mentioned, were not following the Sheikh Jarrah case closely, as a member of the families and as someone who's been engaged with them for the duration of this period and are especially social media and media amplification, I want to tell people that we do have what proves to be fraudulent documents that these settler groups are using in Israeli courts. Just want to make that clear. Because what the kind of documents that they're bringing forward, they're relying on, we found no traces of those whatsoever. These claims are baseless, based on research and a visit actually by our lawyer to the Ottoman Empire archives in Turkey. So there's no mention of these. There's nothing that proves the ownership claims by Jews of these lands. Just to make that clear.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Mark and Michael, would you have anything to add to sort of the Sheikh Jarrah discussion that we haven't sort of touched on here? Yeah, no, it's great. It's great, Rasha, and thank you. And obviously we're we're just so heartbroken for what your family and what that whole community has to go through. Obviously, you've become a symbol for so many people and for so much, and we, you know, may you have strength and fortitude and courage as you face that, because it's not something that's going to go away, is it? As long as the current regime is in place, as long as the world doesn't say this, enough is enough.
Agreed, 100%. And I was on the phone with my mom actually just a few hours ago, and she like, we coordinate on media engagements, and she sits with a lot of media representatives in Jerusalem, and she's like we can't stop, like, now, even if they announce a ceasefire, we cannot stop talking about Sheikh Jarrah and what's happening. And I was like, of course not. We need to keep our voices heard. We need to make sure that we still engage with the media, because yeah, this might go away from the public scene, from the public view, but what the Israeli occupying forces tend to do is just expand and use the calm days to just basically take more land and build an apartheid wall and make sure that Palestinians have no basis for a future state. That's exactly what's happening. And Sheikh Jarrah represents that. It's a constant reminder, right? Like, you look at it, and it's a reminder of the displacement that happened in 1948, and wiping that out. For the Israelis, it's a possibility for them to unify Jerusalem the way they wanted to look, and basically empty Jerusalem of Palestinians, of any Arab population, and make sure that there's only a Jewish majority.
Yeah, thank you. Michael pointed out a week and a half ago that, that the action to evict or to force those families from their homes to some degree was delayed because of the demonstrations, because of the international outrage. So it's incumbent upon us not to let go either. And as much as your family is resolute in holding on to that, in staying steadfast, I think that's also a message to us as an international community of support, that we likewise need to be steadfast, that we can't forget about Sheikh Jarrah. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I just want to move to a couple of a couple of themes that are really standing out in the questions.
Yes, go ahead.
Because there's always, and it is what on a lot of people's minds. So it's the boogeyman that is Hamas, and what do you do with Jewish claims to that God promised the land to them and all of that stuff. It's really rather simple with the first one, and then I'll get to Hamas. Nobody denies the presence of Jewish history in this land. It exists. It is one of among many histories on this land. This idea that that God promised the Jews that this land is just theirs and they were the first sovereigns and they're the only sovereigns to ever exist on it. It's no historian would looks at that seriously. There were Palestinian Jewish people in Palestine prior to the emergence of Zionism, and they lived there as any other Palestinian would. It's the problem here is that idea, again, that's why I emphasize that claim, that exclusivity, right? The idea that this is exclusively Jewish now and all non-Jewish people never belong to this land or don't belong to it, and all of that nonsense, which ignores thousands of years of history of other people on the land. The Palestinians have been there, and Arab history has been there for at least 1,000 years. Prior to Zionism. So these are kind of ludicrous claims, and really the way forward is for a land shared by all and not belonging exclusively to Jews or Israelis or Palestinians. It would be shared by everyone. Where everyone would have equal rights, then we would dismantle the settler, colonial, and apartheid structures that already exist. So that's that point. The second one is on Hamas. So Hamas is a political ideology and a political movement like any other political ideology and movement. It has its roots in the Muslim Brotherhood from Egypt. It broke off from the Muslim Brotherhood in the 1980s. It had a stronghold in Gaza. In the initial stages of its development in the 1980s, Israel and the United States both thought that helping Hamas become a thing was a good thing. They wanted for Hamas to emerge to sort of offset the power and hold of Fatah, the main political party. There are many political parties, of course, in Palestine. There's at least 20, 30. But Fatah was the dominant one, and Israelis and the Americans thought, well, pushing this new group called Hamas onto the stage will kind of create some divisions, and that will help us maintain our hold over these Palestinian populations. Now, eventually, they were like, okay, we're not going to do that. That kind of backfired on us. So they stepped off of that. But Hamas became a strong political force in the 1990s and into the 2000s. Now, one of the main reasons why they won the elections held in 2006 or 2005, 2006, I believe it was the fact that Fatah was corrupt. Most people voted for Hamas not because they followed their political ideology, to the T. It was that they wanted some other new governing party that was not corrupt. And to be fair, in those initial stages, Hamas was much less corrupt than Fatah. Now, that's not the case anymore. If elections were actually held in Gaza today, Hamas would probably lose. That was where some of the pollsters in Palestine were saying that ahead of, I don't know if they're going to do these elections anymore, but the planned elections anyway, and they were going to lose precisely because people were like, well, they're corrupt now. So, the whole labeling of terrorist group and all of that, usually in that discourse, the way that the term terrorism is used in political discourse, it's not really an academic way. It's purely for political reasons. The idea that only terrorist violence causes terror. I mean, look at what Israel just did to Gaza. Look at the terror that caused. So what about state terror? The designation of these groups as terrorist groups and as political parties that need to be sort of blockaded and besieged is part of political strategy and not really grounded in academic sort of scholarly analysis of the term terrorism and what that means and all of that sort of stuff. Usually it is always brought up in Canadian discourse and American discourse to kind of just excuse and justify everything that Israel does. But as Mohammed Kurdi said it on MSNBC last week, who is the US to morally judge anyone? This is a country that has engaged in more wars in the 20th century alone than any other country on earth. This is the country that dropped 2 atomic bombs on unarmed civilians in World War II. Who are they to tell anybody how they ought to defend themselves? So don't spare me the moral high ground that people take, that politicians take, that the media take when they're discussing these issues, especially when they're as some of the comments here are asking about as well, putting billions of dollars into the Israeli military to make it possible for it to do the kind of onslaught that we're seeing these past couple of weeks, and the besiegement of Gaza, which, by the way, yes, Egypt is part of that problem. Israel is certainly gets the fair share of the blame for the besiegement of Gaza, the inhumane besiegement of Gaza. But every country on earth pretty much deserves to be shamed for that, including Canada, which basically supports and actively engages in that besiegement of Gaza. So, please remember that a lot of these talking points that you hear in the media, that you hear by your politicians, compare them to the reality that you're seeing through videos and words and images that Palestinian activists and journalists and scholars and artists are sending you from Palestine, and tell me how they match. And you'll find that they don't. And this is part of the reason, as another question was coming up here about this whole narrative shift in the US, which is there. It's much stronger than it is in Canada. I'll be the first to admit. You know, we always look down on the US as lesser than us, or, you know, we think of ourselves as superior to them. We're not. Their media has been better on this. I've heard, you know, finally the NDP stepped up, but I've heard better comments from some of their politicians that I've heard from ours. And there has been a bit of a narrative shift. Now, I don't celebrate that as we won. I don't celebrate that as we've gotten Palestinian freedom. This is a necessary step, but there's still a long way to go. And the reason why I brought up that narrative shift is that a big part of that is the fact that Palestinian journalists and activists have become so good on social media platform in completely, you know, demystifying all of the mythologies that exist about this issue. You know, they'll put the words of a Netanyahu saying Israel has the right to defend itself, and they'll tell you, okay, they've just, you know, they're pulling children out of the rubble here. That's Israel trying to defend themselves. No, you know, less and less people are buying these narratives. That's a huge reason why there has been that shift. But again, it's not the beginning and end all. The narrative is part of the problem, but it's not the entire problem. There are still, as someone was saying here, you know, the US and Canada are themselves settler colonial states. How do you expect them to go against another settler colonial state when they won't go against their own? Excellent point. The only way I know how is people power. That's why I brought that up. Someone also mentioned about, okay, well, we emailed the politicians, but we didn't see change. Trust me, I'm as frustrated as you are. But change doesn't come quickly, and it won't come from the first try. You have to keep at it. You have to keep at it. You have to keep at it until they go at some point, okay, I'm going to lose votes. That's what moves politicians. When they go, I'm not going to win this election, and that's when they'll start to do some changes. And I'll leave it to Mike and Tom to talk about their ongoing petitions and letters to politicians and all that they do at CJPME. So sign up to them to keep updated on what's happening there.
Yeah, well, you've covered a lot of ground there, Mike. Mark, sorry. Yeah, you covered about 20 questions in there, which was great. I just want to jump in. I think one or two of the things that you said it's worth exploding a little bit. But since you did ask Michael and me to sort of say a word about, you know, these email campaigns and petitions and so on, you know, in as much as, you know, these politicians, they are getting thousands and thousands of emails from our side and also from the other side. And it is well known that they don't necessarily read the emails, but they do count them. And they are very aware of, they got, you know, on smaller issues, they got, you know, 11 in support of this zoning change and 23 against this zoning change and that sort of thing. So they do count emails. And we have had situations in the past where parliamentarians have stood up and said, we got 20,000 emails saying, you know, this should stop. And so it is very significant that, you know, don't worry if you don't get a personalized response because these offices are entirely overwhelmed, but it is at some level a numbers game. And I can safely tell folks that our numbers are better than the other side at this point, much better than the other side. So I think it's, if you see these campaigns, please participate in them. I did want to jump in, and Michael, if you want to say something, but I wanted to ask you, Mark, and maybe the other camp panelists can weigh in on this. You know, as we've seen in some of the questions, there is a little bit of questioning of why has the narrative changed? What's behind that, and so on. And I sense that the Black Lives Matter, the George Floyd demonstration, so that's a big part of what happened. And I wonder if how you feel about that, if you think that's part of it, and what our other panelists may think about that. What may is that, or what? There probably are a number of things, but how would you guys respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll take that. I do think that that's a factor. See, but this is the thing that stomps me, because this time last year is when BLM finally kind of made some major inroads into public discourse and narratives. But I didn't know why that happened then either, because George Floyd was not the first horrific video that we saw, right? Like we've seen so many other horrific videos. So I'm not sure what it was last year that happened. So there may be, like you said, a bunch of different factors. But regardless, BLM did make huge inroads into public discourse, and 100%. The Palestinian struggle is benefiting from the space created by BLM. And I do believe all anti-racist and decolonial struggles are gaining momentum precisely because BLM was so amazing in the space that they created, because these struggles are connected. BLM from the beginning was speaking about Palestinian liberation. Palestinian activists were on the streets with BLM in Ferguson in 2016, before last year. Same with Idle No More. They created some space here in Canada, and they came out with a strong statement of support to the Palestinian struggle this week. I do really think that these struggles are in fact connected. That the same weapons and tactics and strategies that are used to silence Palestinians are the same ones that are used to silence and attack other people, like Black liberation struggle or Indigenous struggle or workers' struggles, or those struggling against authoritarian regimes in Egypt, in Iran, in China, in Zimbabwe, in Uganda, in Chile, in Argentina, and Brazil. The list really goes on and on and on. And so there are so many things that are shared. Of course, there are differences, and we can't lose sight of that, but there are so many similarities in all of these struggles. I do think there is a general discontentment in the world right now with our systems of government, with our economic systems, with the way that the gap between the rich and the powerful and the poor and the powerless has been just increasing over the years. I think maybe perhaps that has something to do with it as well, that people are just more attuned to their shared suffering and their shared discontentment with the world today. But Palestine has always stood in that. Palestinian struggle has always been the struggle of the oppressed. And it has always had those connections with these other movements. So, that continues today. So I certainly give credit to BLM.
Yeah. Michael, do you want to add anything on that?
Well, I'm not sure why it's different, but I think we all have a sense that it is, that there is that the public is responding differently this time. And I did want to name some of those things specifically, because I think it's more than just a feeling. There are real things happening. On one hand, there's Palestinians on national TV interviewed on their own terms, which I think there are some problems with the way that's been done, but it hasn't been done. So I think that's significant, that the Canadians are being exposed to very different narratives than ever before. I think we saw from Canadian political leaders pretty different responses. You have the NDP call for an arms embargo is the first way that they sort of come out of the gate, which is quite significant. You have about 40 or so MPs who have made statements against the evictions in Sheikh Jarrah. Some of those statements are weaker than others, but nonetheless, there's quite a few people of many different parties coming forward. Before, I think when Hamas would fire rockets, I think you would expect to see the Canadian government suddenly change and go all unconditionally standing with Israel. We support Israel no matter what. Certainly that's how they've done it in the past. This time we didn't see that. We saw very weak statements from the Minister of Foreign Affairs, very much a both sides narrative, but not a stand with Israel narrative. And you actually saw Marc Garneau, in each of his statements, he mentioned Sheikh Jarrah. He said it himself when he was questioned about these issues in Parliament. I think that's significant. especially because we know that the same Minister of Foreign Affairs in 2014, during the last sort of major assault on Gaza, Mark Arnault went to a pro-Israel rally and congratulated the Israeli government on its so-called self-defense. So the fact that that the liberal government isn't taking that approach is significant. We also see a handful of members of parliament using terms like apartheid and ethnic cleansing, whereas previously that would have, that would have kicked you out of caucus. So that would have made it you ineligible for running for the NDP, for example. So I think, yeah, these are very significant, I think, changes. It doesn't really get to sort of, it doesn't really challenge the power imbalances necessarily, but I think there are some practical, concrete things we can point to that and say that this is different than before. And so I think the question for me is, how do we build on this? How do we keep pushing? And one of our campaigns, and I put the link in the chat, is we're sending emails it sends an automatic email to your MP, to the Prime Minister, to all the key political leaders like foreign affairs critics, to Canadian ambassadors in Israel and Palestine, and urging them to condemn Israeli violence, to take action against Israeli apartheid and implement the recommendations of the Human Rights Watch report, which had a number of recommendations, including ending arms sales to Israel, individual sanctions on Israeli officials and such. And so I think last time I checked, we're at 16,000 people have sent an email through that tool. So it definitely, they might not read all of them, but they notice when they get 16,000 emails. So I definitely encourage people to keep doing that.
Yeah.
I have a few points, Tom, just hearing Mark and Michael just discuss the reasons behind what we're seeing. I would say it's a combination of a lot of factors, but most importantly, Palestinians on the ground are offering unfiltered content that no one in the world is used to seeing. I would say that's the major reason, that's the major cause of why this took the attention and brought the attention that we're seeing. Another factor, if we talk about whether it's the US or here, and at least from my own experience, the fact that we have voices that represent the Canadian diversity, whether it's in parliament or in the media, especially the media now, we do have people from all kinds of backgrounds and ethnicities and experiences that we did not have before. So those are the people who are paving the way and are no longer shutting you out. So that's huge. It is important because they at least do understand the context, the background, the kind of mentality and where you're coming from, how you're looking at things. So it is very important, and we need to make sure that we appreciate and acknowledge these factors. Add to that COVID, 100%. The fact that people are not traveling, they're not, they are glued to their TV screens and their mobile phones and to social media, and we are all in that boat of wanting to connect together. And I think the fact that people have seen we're connecting with our humanity, right? We are very attentive to what others are feeling more than any time before, any time before that. And it is major, it is important. Of course, we will see a lot of papers and reports and analytic reports about like in-depth understanding of what we're seeing and why is this happening? Why are we why are we seeing the kind of attention that we're seeing now? So we will probably see very scientific explanations of what's happening. But from an observer point of view, and for someone who has worked with people across the world, like in the past few weeks, we've spoken to people in Turkey, in Romania, and like the fact that there's podcasts and platforms, and there is already a challenge to the mainstream media. People are fed up of hearing the same kind of reporting and seeing the same kind of reporting coming from the same people, and the fact that a lot is being blocked out of viewers' screens and TV screens. There is already a rebellion against that. There is definitely a rebellion against the brutal use of force, whether it's against African Americans or, as Mark mentioned, elsewhere in the world, but most importantly in Palestine, because it's repetitive. It happens, it reoccurs, and no one is breaking that circuit. So breaking the silence among a lot of Palestinians, a lot of pro-Palestine solidarity groups, and most importantly, Jewish voices. We do need to touch on that, because from what I'm seeing, whether it's here in the US and even inside the occupied Palestine, you can see that there are Jewish voices that are standing in solidarity with Palestine. They do represent the free voices, and that's a shift. It is significant to also pay attention to that. So that's from my observation, at least. And yeah, Palestinians, especially this generation that knew nothing but occupation, despite of all the peace agreements and the Oslo Accords. Like, this is the Oslo Accord generation. And the fact that they saw firsthand the consequences of an already clinically dead peace agreement, and so the results on the ground, like I lived in that phase where the apartheid wall got constructed, checkpoints were everywhere. For me to go to my university, Bueckert University, it took me hours and hours to get there. The fact that we saw all that segregation and division within the Palestinian cities and villages. So on one hand, they were talking about peace negotiations, but on the ground, the reality was totally different. So there was this ongoing constant frustration among Palestinians and the young generation, which they thought would actually know nothing and adopt nothing but the attempts for peace and normalization of relations with Israel. But people saw on the ground what the reality was, and the disconnect between what is being advertised on TV screens and in news bulletins versus what was happening actually on the ground. So this is the generation that is now approaching what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah and is speaking out. And yes, they're speaking different languages and are engaged in a lot of platforms, but these are grassroots groups with the combination of the other factors.
Great. No, these are all great insights from all of you. Thank you very much for your perspective. I would suggest that we try and tackle two more questions. My clock says 9:05 Eastern time. We said we'd take an hour and a bit here. I think there are two questions that actually came in the Q&A. We've had we've had lots and lots of questions in the Q&A. There's, I think, 95 of them. We've covered a lot of them in sort of a general sense, a lot of them related to Hamas and some of these other things. But there are two questions that's sort of a repeating theme. And why don't we try to see if we can get some quick input from our panelists on these. First is, what would you guys say to address the question of, anti-Semitism, accusations of anti-Semitism being used as a means to shut down discussion? I think a lot of people, my kids, for instance, they're in a situation where for the first time ever, they're talking to their friends and they hear about accusations of anti-Semitism. What advice would you give to people to respond to those accusations of anti-Semitism on this?
Yeah, I can take that. I would love to hear what Mark and Michael also have to say on this, but I would definitely say it goes to the fact, focus on the fact that this is not a Jewish Muslim fight. This is not a Jewish-Muslim conflict. So when you criticize Israel, you're criticizing the actions of a colonial settler regime. If you're criticizing Saudi Arabia, you're not criticizing Islam. Just like if you're criticizing India, you're not criticizing the Hindu religion or the, you know what I mean? It's as simple as that. Palestinians are Muslims and Christians. This has nothing to do with being a religious conflict. Its roots might be for a lot of people, and the fact that they are looking at Palestine as the promised land and all of that. But let's look at the reality. Palestine hosts churches, synagogues, mosques. Palestinians, as Mark mentioned, lived in harmony, in coexistence, as Jews, as Muslims, and as Christians. So for us as Palestinians, our criticism of Israel has nothing to do with the religion, and we need to differentiate between the two things here.
Yeah, great. Mark, Michael?
Yeah, I just want to add this. Yeah, I mean, someone brought up the IHRA and the JDA. The JDA is obviously better than the IHRA, but it shares the same fundamental flaw as the IHRA, which is to argue that basically the first thing that we ought to look at when Palestinians critique Israel is whether or not they're anti-Semitic. That's what the JDA proposes as well. So I'm opposed to it just as I am opposed to the IHRA because it does that. Because the Palestinian resistance to Israel has nothing to do with its Jewish nature or Jewish character. If Egyptian Muslims in the 20th century decided to create an Egyptian Islamic state by kicking out the Palestinians and replacing them with Egyptian Muslims, the Palestinians would resist them just as fiercely. No group of people on earth, I come back to this, no group of people on earth takes kindly to their expulsion from their lands. Who accepts that? Who says, yes, please kick me off the land that I've lived on for generations to make a home for someone else? That's not expected of anyone to be okay with. People are not, and it's funny, people kind of always bring up this whole, well, how long in history do you have? If you just moved into a house 2 years ago and someone came and said, you're out of there now, this is mine, you'd be upset. You don't have to say, I've had this house for 20,000 years in order to claim existence on it. You're just like, no, this is mine. I've lived here for even 2 months. Why would you be okay with that? So, of course, Palestinians are not okay with being kicked off of their lands. And once again, you know, the only future is one where the land is shared and everybody has equal rights on it. When we dismantle racism and dismantle apartheid and dismantle settler colonialism. So you know, anti-Semitism is, of course, a very serious problem in Canadian society, in American society, in European society. Europe gave us the horrendous violence of anti-Semitism, right? Like that's where it originated. And the Palestinian struggle is in fact a struggle against those very same forces that gave us anti-Semitism, that introduced to the world anti-Semitism. So really at the root of it, the struggle is actually shared. Unfortunately, we're not seeing enough of those connections. You know, I love working with the Jewish groups that Rasha named. I work with them now. I'll continue to work with them moving forward. They are my friends and they're my comrades. But we need to see more. We need to see more. You know, I saw in Israel, you know, a report celebrating 60 teens refusing military service. Thank you, those 60 teens. Awesome. But 60 is not going to cut it. Yeah. We need more. And you know, and I want to go back to one of the comments that was mentioned earlier, that there were these mobs walking around Palestinian neighborhoods, terrorizing Palestinian neighborhoods. And they were not soldiers. They were Israeli civilians. And we saw many videos, even on CBC, not just the videos that you're finding on social media platforms, of Israeli civilians calling for, you know, nuking Gaza. death to Arabs all the time, right? Like, so there are some serious issues within Israeli society and the Israeli state. It's not just a matter of a few bad politicians. There's a reason Netanyahu, despite his horrendous corruption and incredibly reckless handling of the economy, there's a reason why he keeps getting elected and why the right wing keeps getting stronger and stronger in Israel. It's because people, they reflect the views of that society. And so there are some serious obstacles here, and the way forward can only be through pressure on Israel, and pressure means sanctions. There's the only path forward. Words from our politicians are useless. Palestinians have all the words they'll ever need for comfort, and they come from Palestinians. Palestinian artists, Palestinian scholars, Palestinian activists, Palestinian children, their words, their tears, that's what will provide us comfort. That's what will keep us going. Nothing that Trudeau can say will ever match those words. But actions by our politicians, sanctions on Israel, they can bring support to the Palestinian people. And that's what's needed to make Israel change its behavior. Because the world has just given Israel a green light for decades now. And they are showing you what that looks like. Yeah. They will completely unleash of modern advanced military against a stateless people. Again, please keep this in mind. You don't have to support Hamas. I don't. You don't have to like their political ideology. I don't. But this is not a military versus military issue here. These are a stateless people versus a state violence, a state military. And so keep that in mind whenever you hear those talking points. That's really important. Yes.
Oh, well, this great, and to some degree, Mark, you've helped me to segue to what I'd like to suggest as our last question, and we got to give Michael a chance to get in here too. But you've talked about the solution and where we need to go, Mark. But the final question I'd like to suggest, somebody said, what would be a fair and just solution? So if you guys had your druthers, what would you suggest as an end state at some point? Maybe tomorrow, maybe 50 years from now, hopefully sooner rather than later. But what would be a fair and just solution based on where we are now? Do you want to start, Michael, or do you want to?
I guess I'll say it's not really my place to say what a just solution should be. I think we really have to take, as people in the solidarity movement, we have to take the lead from people on the ground. And having said that, I do think that there are historic claims for many peoples in the entire land, and the idea of segregating that land for different peoples in different areas is not a practical or fair or just solution. It has to, coexistence. You can't have coexistence with military occupation or with segregation and apartheid. And I don't think that a two-state solution necessarily would bring about a just and fair reality for people on the ground. I think it would actually it would solidify those divides and those structures of power in very unfair ways. And so I think we need to think about rights. What are the best solutions that enhance the rights and freedoms of every person, and not focus on an approach that would build an ethno-state or states for specific people. I think we have to move away from that. It's tricky because the Palestinian leadership, a lot of people are still very much focused on a two-state solution, and that means that there's not really an international consensus for what for where to go. But I just don't see that being a solution.
Great.
If I may add just on something that Mark also mentioned about the military and the 60 people who refused to join the Israeli military. I think we need, just because we're here talking about also what Canada can do, and I see a lot of questions in the Q&A, curious to know, I would say pressure the government to stop the groups that are actually trying to enlist Canadians in the Israeli military. And it's happening. I don't know if it could be a surprise for some of our guests and participants, but it is happening. There's an active enlistment of Canadians in the Israeli military, and the same applies to the US. So we need to refuse that. A second point that I want to make is what Michael mentioned about the two-state solution. Unfortunately, that's not even viable in the, once you visit and see how divided and segregated and even the way the cities and villages are just put in a way where there's no possibility whatsoever for a viable Palestinian state with such conditions and under such conditions. I would say the first thing that we need to focus on is making sure that Israel is announced as an occupying force. That's the most important thing. They are an occupying force against indigenous Palestinians. We start there. Once we start there, we will be able to figure out what needs to be done. But unless we look at Israel as an occupying force, we will move nowhere and get to nowhere. Second of all, we need to stop treating Israel as being above the law. There's numerous UN resolutions. There are voices, emerging voices about sanctions and imposing sanctions against Israel. Why are they getting a free hand? Why are they being given a green light? There were sanctions against other countries, including in the region. So why can't we apply the same things on Israel? So we need to tackle these issues as well before we go and try to figure out a solution. Because for me, people talk about peace. Peace is fine and dandy, but what about justice? Equal rights. I want my right to live on Palestinian land and be able to expand and have the same rights. And if I want to build a new house, I don't have to wait for years and years, and that would never come actually. And then if I build illegally, I will have to demolish my house and even pay a fine. I don't want to be in the case of Sheikh Jarrah. Why do Palestinian residents of Jerusalem have to go to an Israeli court to find justice, seek justice? It's unacceptable, and we will never reach to that conclusion or objective, because at the end of the day, their legal system is an arm of their occupation. So there are a lot of, it's not as easy as it looks. I know people would say it's complicated, but it's also not that complicated. It's occupation. It's as simple as that. Get rid of occupation. We will talk later.
Mark, any closing comments? What would be a fair and just solution?
Yeah, I mean, so look, we can draw up plans on what a new place looks like and all that, and I do that, as many scholars have done that, and there's nothing wrong with that. But ultimately, Rasha's right. We're so far from that right now. We just need to focus on this first baby step, which is, we just need to start to put pressure. Even, let me just put it this way, even if tomorrow Canada imposes sanctions on Israel, we're still a long ways away. Right? I also want to say this. So I want to shift the focus, because again, the vision eventually would be a liberated land. That would be liberated from these exclusivist ideologies, and certainly liberated and de-Zionized, as many people have called it. So that it doesn't matter if you're Jewish, Muslim, Christian, you get to live with freedom and liberty and equal rights and all of those things on the land. The refugees have the right to return, the Palestinian refugees. All of that is guaranteed. But to get there, we just need to get off this path that we're on right now, because the path that we are on right now is one where Israel controls the entire land and rules over the Palestinian population, and possibly in the future, another event of ethnic cleansing like we saw in 1948. I mean, Israel openly talks about a greater Israel. Well, a greater Israel means an Israel over the entire land of historic Palestine. And since, according to their own nation state law, it has to be a state for the Jewish people only, or a majority Jewish people, then that means they got to get it to up to 80% Jewish, 20% non-Jewish. Well, right now it's about 50-50. So to get it to 80-20, that means another mass expulsion. I mean, this is what we heard from early Zionists prior to 1948. We're hearing similar discourse. In fact, it's more intense now. So the path that we're on right now is leading us towards more expulsions, more ethnic cleansing, more violence. And we need to get off that path. That's number one concern. And to do that, the places like Canada can take actions to do it. Don't give me, we're a middle power, what can we do nonsense. If Canada as a middle power takes a lead on this, starts sanctions, for example, guess what? Other middle powers will go, well, if Canada did it and they're right there next to the US and they're willing to do that to them, what's my excuse, Sweden? What's my excuse, Denmark? What's my excuse, maybe New Zealand? And the ball gets rolling, and all of a sudden the United States might go, well, enough of my allies now are doing this. Maybe I should reconsider mine. That's how things change in politics, right? So don't give me this middle power, we can't do anything nonsense. Canada can do this, can take a lead, and maybe actually live up to one of those ideals that we're always talking about, that we stand for, but we never do. Sanctions is the first step. Pressure on Israel is the only way to get it to get off that path that I just described, that path of violence that I just described. So let's start there. And I have full faith that in the dismantling of settler colonialism, in the dismantling of apartheid, that a just solution can appear. But we've got to start dismantling this system.
And if I may add, call things for what they are. It's as simple as that. Do not accept being bullied if you get accused of being an anti-Semite every time you criticize Israel. If you speak up and you allow yourself to take the heat, it might happen once, twice, but if there's so many voices saying the same thing, what can they do about it? If there's hundreds and thousands and then tens of thousands and then hundreds of thousands of people who are saying the same thing and criticizing Israel for its actions and its brutal attacks against Palestinians, then we will get somewhere.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, guys, I have thoroughly enjoyed this. Just some fantastic perspectives. As I said, we did get 110 questions at the end. I think we probably covered, at least not specifically maybe to the exact letter of the question, we've covered an awful lot of the content that was referenced in those questions. So thank you very much. Thanks also to our audience, for all of you who took the time to stay with us. I think we started off with a little over 300 and we still have 250 with us. So thanks for staying with us. I thought it was certainly worth saying. I learned a lot. So hopefully you did too. CJPME is here, guys, as a resource. We love to hear from our supporters. Our email is info@cjpme.org. So please feel free to get in touch at any time. Mark and Rasha, they've been great, and a lot of groups and people working on this issue talk together and work together, and it's just been great. Why don't we give a big round of applause to our panelists? I guess I'm the only one that can clap, but hopefully people are clapping at home. Thanks again to our audience members, and I apologize to anyone who submitted a question. We're able to get it. And stay tuned. We'll be trying to do other webinars like this in the future. Thanks again, and good night, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.